Okay, chapter 7 looks at social process theories. Social process theories are looking at how individuals interact with society. Those theories include social learning theory, social control, and labeling theory. Now, social development theories are going to look at how we change in our offending over time. Okay, this keeps happening, so we're going to move to a different view. My apologies. Okay, so social learning theory and differential association theories. Social learning theory says that all behavior is learned in the same way, and crime is learned as well. People learn to commit crime from others, and crime is a product of our social environment. It's not an innate characteristic. So differential association theory, the author of this theory is Edwin Sutherland, and he talks about this in a textbook. He says that crime is learned through a process of differential association with others, that those people communicate criminal values and advocate for the commission of crime. He also tells us that all significant human behavior is learned, and crime is not different from any other human behavior. It too is learned. Now, there's 9 principles or tenets of differential association. Criminal behavior is learned in interaction with others in intimate personal groups. What you learn is not only the techniques of committing crimes, but also how you would rationalize that and why you might want to engage in that behavior. Now, the specific direction of those motives and drives, whether you see that as favorable or unfavorable. Now, a person becomes delinquent because more of their definitions of the law point to breaking the law. Now, those differential associations can vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity, but it involves the same mechanisms for learning as any other type of learning. And finally, Sutherland tells us that while criminal behavior is an expression of general needs and values, it's not explained by those needs and values. Now, differential association is widely accepted in the mid-20th century. It's pretty popular because it has both psychological and sociological elements. But today our research focuses on measuring what types of association are most likely to lead to continued criminal involvement. Now, some critiques of this theory. It doesn't really apply at the individual level. So even people who experience an excess of definitions favorable to breaking the law still might not actually break the law. And those who rarely associate with recognized deviance may still turn to crime. The other big issue here is that this theory is pretty hard to test. It's also not a sufficient explanation for crime alone. So it doesn't really provide for free choice, and it doesn't explain why some people can maintain non-criminal attitudes even if they're surrounded by people who have criminal attitudes. It also doesn't account for how those values emerge in the first place, only how they're communicated from one person or one group of people to another. Now, social control theories are looking at the opposite. They assume that there's plenty of reason for people to break the law. They want to know, why would people obey the rules? Now, Reckless talks about containment theory, and Reckless says that crime is a consequence of social pressures to violate the law and failure to resist those pressures. And he basically compares this to a biological immune response, that it's like a sickness, and it results from the failure of control mechanisms, both internal and external. Now, external containment is what's referred to as, quote, the holding power of the group. Basically, society holds individuals within the bounds of accepted norms and expectations. Now, inner containment is your ability to follow those expected norms, and that's enhanced by a positive self-image, having socially approved goals, having a good tolerance for frustration, etc. Now, containment theory also talks about pushes and pulls. Pushes towards crimes are things that might propel someone into crime. That's a criminogenic background, a delinquent subculture, biological propensities, psychological maladjustment. Now, there's also pulls towards crime. Those are the perceived rewards of crime: financial gain, sexual satisfaction, and higher status. Now, containment then is a stabilizing force. If it is effective, it blocks pushes and pulls from leading someone towards crime. Now, recklessness pushes and pulls against crime have been criticized as a very personal interpretation. They're not part of a fixed formation of psychological impulses and drives. They could be feelings in the moment that have been conditioned through individual thought processes. Now, Kaplan talks about self-esteem and said that people who are ridiculed by their peers suffer a loss of self-esteem. They assess themselves poorly, and then they abandon the motivation to conform. And there are studies that support the idea that low self-esteem does foster delinquent behavior. But delinquency can also enhance self-esteem for some delinquents, particularly those whose self-esteem is very low. Now, Travis Hershey talks about social bond theory. And Hershey talks about how we all have a bond to society. We have bonds to each other, and we have bonds to the social groups to which we belong. When that bond is weakened or broken, deviance and crime may result. Now, this bond is made up of 4 elements: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. Attachment is your shared personal interest with others. These are the people you care about, those attachments you have, the people whose personal opinions matter to you. Commitment is the amount of time and energy put into conforming activities, and involvement is the amount of time spent with others in shared activities. And then beliefs are your shared value and moral systems. Now, a breakdown in any one of these areas can result in a breakdown in that bond to society, and that bond is what is keeping you from breaking the law. Now, Hershey also authors The General Theory of Crime with Michael Gottfredson, and they're looking here at low self-control. And they said low self-control accounts for all crime at all times. Self-control is the degree to which we are vulnerable to temptations. We acquire self-control early in life, and this low self-control combined with impulsivity is the main individual level cause of crime. And how do we learn self-control? We learn it from our parents. Now, this theory is built on a rational choice perspective, and it's basically saying offenders lack control over their own desires. A well-developed social bond will result in the creation of effective self-control mechanisms. Now, Wickstrom suggests that self-control can best be analyzed as a situational concept, not an individual trait. Now, situational action theory says our ability to exercise self-control is an outcome of the interaction between our personal traits and our immediate situation. Personal morality and moral context provide a filter that prevents some people from considering crime as a realistic possibility. Now, social bond theory is criticized for its basic premise that those who commit deviant behavior know that it is against social norms but commit it anyway. And having strong bonds is not always enough to stop us from breaking the law. Now, the general theory of crime has been criticized for being very simplistic and ignoring the complexity of the criminal process. Now, Tittle talks about control balance theory, and this is a blend of social bond and containment perspectives. And basically, he's suggesting that both too much control is bad and too little control is bad. So what we want to have is a balance of control. And he talks about the control ratio. That's the amount of control to which we are subject versus the amount of control that we actually exert over other people. It can predict the probability that an individual will engage in crime and the form it will take. And here we have a diagram of this. So what we're really looking at here is control surpluses and control deficits. A control surplus is when we have high levels of control, maybe too much control. We can exercise control over others, and we'll work to extend that control through deviant acts. So we may do that by exploiting power, plundering, or engaging in decadence. Now, a control deficit is low levels of control or being over-controlled. This can result in deviance as an attempt to escape repressive controls through being predatory, through defying people, or submission. So deviance occurs when a person realizes that deviance can help reset that control ratio. Now, social control theories assume that people are automatically nonconformists unless socialized through social control mechanisms. They don't recognize the role of human motivation or conditions that propel people to associate with and learn from others. They basically assume most people would commit crime if they had the chance. Now, labeling theory becomes popular in the 60s, and it looks at how we respond to known offenders. And once we label them, how does that label contribute to future offending? So this theory talks about tagging. It's essentially that label. It happens to an offender after arrest, conviction, and sentencing. Once someone is defined as bad, they don't have as many legitimate opportunities. This may mean they can only associate with others who are also defined as bad. That continued association with other bad people can lead to continued crime. Now, labeling theory also talks about primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance occurs before that label is attached. It's the initial deviant act, and it may be used to solve an immediate problem, meet group expectations. Now, secondary deviance is continued deviant acts. They occur when that primary deviance results in tagging with the status of criminal. Once someone has been labeled a bad person. If they internalize that, if they start to accept that as who they are, then they may assume that role and engage in continued deviance. So society's response to behavior is what creates deviance and the deviant person. There is no act that is intrinsically deviant or criminal. They're defined as such by others. Now, it also talks about moral entrepreneurs, and these are people who engage in the process of moral enterprise. This is when a particular group with a particular interest makes an effort to have its sense of proper behavior embodied in the law. Now, labeling theory has made some contributions to criminology. Deviance is the result of social processes involving the imposition of definitions rather than the consequence of any particular human activity. So you achieve a status as a deviant person by virtue of a social definition. So it's not that there's something innate about you that makes you deviant. It's that you have broken rules that society has deemed to be deviant. Society's reaction to deviant behavior and those who engage in it is a major element in determining whether or not we see a person as a criminal. And negative self-images can result from how the criminal justice system processes people. Now, labeling by society and handling by the justice system tend to perpetuate crime and delinquency rather than reduce it. Now, some critiques of labeling theory. It doesn't really address the origin of crime and deviance. It's very hard to test and therefore doesn't have very much empirical support. It also has little to say about people who engage in crime but are never caught and therefore never labeled as deviant. Now, one thing we always want to think about when we think about theories is if they say X causes crime, then we have to figure out how we can intervene. So if the problem here is self-control or a lack of pro-social bonds, then we want programs that enhance self-control and build pro-social bonds. Now, if you look in your text, they're going to tell you about several programs that aim to do that. Now, the social development process is looking at human development, which is the relationship between a maturing individual and their changing environment. Now, the social development perspective acknowledges that human development begins at birth and takes place within a social context. So developmental theories, which are often called the life course perspective, tell us that criminal behavior tends to follow a pattern across the life cycle. Crime is uncommon during childhood, begins in our late adolescence, early adulthood, and diminishes and probably disappears by age 30 or 40. Now, some people never or rarely commit crimes, and others become career criminals and persist in this behavior throughout their lives. Now, life course criminology focuses on questions about how that shifts, how offending shifts over the entire life course. So it's not focusing so much on why people begin offending and really emphasizes the study of criminal careers. So they evaluate the prevalence, frequency, and onset of offending, and they also try to look at different developmental pathways. What are some pathways that lead people to crime? They examine trajectories and transitions as well. And a trajectory is a long-term pattern and sequence of behavior. It's basically a pathway. Whereas transitions are specific events that happen. They're embedded within a trajectory and they may change that trajectory. Now, there's some dynamic concepts included in this perspective. One is activation, and that includes acceleration, stabilization, and diversification, aggravation, and then desistance. So basically, the onset of offending, how that gets increased, and then how it decreases. Now, social development theories are associated with social problems approach, and they tend to focus on key life course determinants that are set in motion in early childhood and adolescence. So it leads to questions of whether those who make wrong choices should be held accountable. Now, Sampson and Laub talk about age-graded theory, okay? And they're two of the big theorists in this developmental or life course perspective. And they did some research that found that delinquent children frequently had trouble at school and home and had friends that were already involved in delinquency. Now, there's two major life events that these transitions that can take somebody off that path of delinquency, deviant criminal behavior, and reduce their frequency of offending. And that's marriage and job stability. Delinquency is more likely to occur when bonds to society are weak or broken. And social ties embedded in our transitions explain variations in crime that may not be accounted for by things that happened in our childhood. So this is incorporating some social bond theory, but also the significance of continuity and change over the life course. Now, they talk a lot about turning points. These are crucial life experiences that can change behavior. They can turn people towards or away from crime and delinquency. And the key turning points that have really been focused on in research, which have a lot of support, are employment and marriage. Now, they also talk about They also talk about social capital, and that's the degree of positive relationships that we build up over the course of our lives. The more social capital we have, the less likely we are to be involved in criminal activity. Now, some critiques of this theory: it doesn't explain why social capital prevents some people from participating in crime and not others. It doesn't explain if social capital actually changes our behavior or limits access to crime. And it hasn't really defined what a positive relationship is. Now, Moffat describes two pathways to crime. Moffat talks about life course persistent offenders and adolescent limited offenders. Most offenders are adolescent limited offenders. Their offending is rooted in biological changes that happen during puberty. And they tend to start offending in their probably mid-teen years, and stop offending in their late teens, early 20s. Now, life course persistent offenders start offending sooner. They engage in more serious crime, and they continue offending into adulthood. And that's because theirs is not rooted in just those biological changes that happen in puberty. It's also rooted in individual traits that make them susceptible to criminal behavior. Now, research cannot definitely show that family and psychological dysfunction is directly related to parent control or individual trajectory. But in general, these ideas are well supported and have a lot of acceptance in criminology. Now, Farrington talks about delinquent developmental theory and talks about persistence and desistance. Persistence is continuing in crime, and desistance is stopping your involvement in crime. Now, unaided desistance is without any formal intervention, whereas aided desistance means you have stopped, but the justice system got involved, and that's why you stopped. Now, Farrington participated in this Cambridge study in delinquent development, and this is a longitudinal life course study. So they're following people over a long period of time, and they're tracking a cohort. So a cohort is a group of people born in the same year. So they're following 411 boys born in London in 1953. And those participants have been interviewed 9 times. And they have found that life course patterns that are found in the U.S. are also found in England as well. Now, they looked at risk factors for delinquency that characterize persistent offenders. And they found that offending tends to peak around age 17 or 18 and then decline And by age 35, most people had conforming lifestyles. Now, Laub and LeBlanc identified 4 components of desistance. One is deceleration, slowing down in the frequency of offending. Specialization, that's a reduction in the variety of offenses one's engaging in. De-escalation is reducing the seriousness of the offending. And then reaching a ceiling, that's remaining at a certain level of offending and not committing any more serious offenses. Now, some critiques of Farrington. The methodology and how desistance is conceptualized has been criticized. And some criminologists argue that the claim that aging causes desistance is meaningless because it doesn't explain what mechanism leads to desistance. Now, evolutionary ecology is a cohort analysis. So as I mentioned, a cohort is a group of people born in the same year. Sometimes it's also a group of people who start something at the same year. So usually this type of analysis begins at birth and traces the development of a population whose members share a common characteristic. And as I mentioned in this previous couple of slides, it's also longitudinal. It follows people over a long period of time. So one of the most famous cohort analysis is Wolfgang's. Now, Wolfgang is my mentor's mentor, and he studied a birth cohort in Philadelphia and found a small group of chronic juvenile offenders accounted for most juvenile arrests. And this is often referred to as the chronic 6%. 6% of offenders accounted for 52% of all criminal arrests. Now, this is important because if we can target that 6%, we can drastically reduce criminal behavior. Now, evolutionary ecology builds on social ecology and emphasizes developmental pathways that we encounter early in our life. So how do we develop over the course of our lives? Wolfgang's analysis is criticized for its lack of a second cohort, a control group that could be measured against it. But it's important to know that Wolfgang actually followed everybody that was born in Philadelphia in that year. Now, Dr. Tracy, who was my mentor, he did a birth cohort analysis as well. And he followed, again, everybody that was born in a particular year in Philadelphia. He followed a group that then came of age in the 60s and 70s. So while Vietnam was going on, civil rights movement in the United States. Now, Thornberry talks about interactional theory and says that delinquency is caused by, yes, that we can bond to society, and then an environment in which we can learn bad behavior, criminal behavior, and be rewarded for that. And delinquent peers are particularly important in providing that necessary environment. So this creates a causal loop. You hang out with bad kids, that leads to bad activities, and then that leads to hanging out with bad kids, which leads to more bad activities. This doesn't fully appreciate the idea of childhood maltreatment, though, and the role that that plays in delinquent behavior. Now, developmental pathways looks at manifestations of disruptive behaviors in childhood and that they're often age dependent. So the key thing here is we can often detect these problems at a very early age. Children who are unable to develop adequate verbal coping skills distinguish themselves early on. Okay, those are going to be kids that are aggressive and intensely aggressive. They're going to be initiating hostile conflict and have a difficult temperament. And we can, as I said, we can see that pretty early on. Now, the program of research on the causes and correlates of delinquency has 3 longitudinal studies that looked at how youths develop within the context of family, school, peers, and community. And they found 3 separate developmental pathways to delinquency. Now, these can overlap, they can converge with each other. You don't have to follow strictly one pathway. And you can see these 3 pathways here, right? On the left, we have this overt pathway. It starts with minor aggression, leads to physical fighting, and then violent behavior. In the middle, we have this authority conflict pathway. We see stubborn behavior, defiance and disobedience, and then authority avoidance. The covert pathway shows us minor covert behavior, property damage, and then moderate to serious delinquency. And as I mentioned, these can all overlap. Now, how do we move to desistance? The Pathways to Desistance is a big study. It's the largest longitudinal study of serious adolescent offending ever conducted. Its key findings are that there is a decrease in self-reported offending by most serious adolescent offenders. Most people age out of crime. The longer we incarcerate somebody, that is not effective in reducing recidivism. Community-based supervision is effective as an aftercare for incarcerated youth, and substance abuse treatment also has a positive effect. The idea of developmental pathways suffers from some definitional issues, though. Now, the Chicago Human Development Project is a longitudinal analysis of how individuals, families, institutions, and communities evolve together. And it looked at how criminal behavior evolves from birth to age 32. Now, early results have led to targeted interventions intended to lower the rates of offending. So policy implications for social development theory are comprehensive strategies for serious, violent, chronic offenders. This program provides communities that participate in it with a framework for preventing delinquency, intervening early in delinquent behavior, and how to respond to serious, violent, chronic offending. The targeted outreach program diverts at-risk juveniles into activities intended to develop a sense of belonging, competence, usefulness, and self-control. And that wraps up our chapter.